Hello everyone, and welcome to Sleepy Historic Storyteller. Here, history isn't loud or rushed, only the gentle whispers of the past remain. Let your mind unwind, close your eyes, if you like, and join me as we drift through fascinating tales from history, guiding you toward a peaceful sleep after a long, tiring day. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so together we can bring these quiet stories of the past to more people. Now, let's step into tonight's story with me. Part 1. Bread, Beer, and the Morning Sun. In the hush of early morning, before the Nile turns gold with sunlight, a woman kneels beside a stone basin, her hands steady from years of repetition, grind soaked hammer wet with a stone roller. The grinding is slow, rhythmic, so slow that time itself seems to press pause. There's no rush. The bread is not for a feast, not for guests. It's the same flat round she makes every day, the kind that's torn by hand, dipped in sour beer, and eaten without a word. Her children stir in corner, wrapped in linen, heads still heavy from sleep. A clay pot simmers nearby, filled with beer, cloudy, low in alcohol, thick with leftover grain. The drink of farmers, builders, priests. Everyone drinks beer. It's safer than water. The oven outside is still warm from the night before. Ashes whisper under a curved clay dome. She shapes dough into rounds, dusted with sand, bakes them directly on hot stones. The crust blackens, smoke curls lazily into the morning air. Her husband returns from the riverbank, barefoot and silent, with a palm leaf basket of dried fish, salted, shriveled, sharp smelling. It will be sliced, thin and eaten with the bread. No spice, just salt, smoke, and survival. The sun creeps higher. The shadows shrink on the white-washed wall. The children wake. Bread is broken. Beer is poured. No one speaks. This is breakfast in ancient Egypt, and it has been for a very long time. Part 2. Garlic, onions, and ritual flavor. In ancient Egypt, garlic and onions were more than food. They were protection, medicine, offering, and power, wrapped in layers of scent and meaning. You could find them in the hands of builders, on the altars of temples, and buried in the tombs of kings. In the early morning, as workers walked toward the limestone quarries or the rising scaffolds of a temple, they chewed cloves of garlic, not just to fill their bellies, but to fortify their bodies. The sharp sting on the tongue was believed to give strength, to keep illness at bay, and to protect from curses whispered on hot desert winds. Onions, with their many layers, were said to reflect the structure of the universe, a symbol of eternity, of the heavens surrounding the earth. A peeled onion might be placed near the bed of someone ill, not to be eaten, but to draw the sickness away. A crushed bulb might be burned with incense in hopes of keeping spirits from lingering too long. When a family gathered to prepare food, onions were added early, not only to flavor the lentils or the stews, but to purify the pot. Priests, before a ceremony, might rub their skin with garlic oil. believing it would cleanse their aura, sharpen their minds, and keep impure thoughts from following them into the temple. And when that came, it came with the smell of onions. Dried rings of the bulb were placed around the necks of the dead, sometimes tucked between the bandages of mummies, not for nourishment, but for protection. It was said that even in the afterlife, the soul might need something familiar, something strong, something that once grew in the dust of the Nile and could chase away darkness. So while we might think of garlic and onions as kitchen staples, for the people of the Nile, they were closer to amulets, pungent, sacred, and always near. Part 3. Salted fish and cracked pots in the heat of the Egyptian sun. When the Nile receded and the air grew still, fishers stood ankle deep in the river shallows, casting nets woven from flax. The day's catch would not be eaten fresh. No, that was a luxury for rare occasions. Instead, the fish were taken inland, gutted with practiced fingers, and laid flat on woven reed mats. Salt, precious, and coarse, was rubbed into the fish flesh. There came time and sun. The fish dried slowly in open courtyards, sometimes on rooftops, sometimes by the temple walls, and their scent mingled with dust, sweat, and the quiet chatter of women who watch over the curing to preserve flavor and ward off insects. Clay pots with cracked legs were used to store the drying fish. These pots had lived many lives, once filled with beer, then reused for grain, then as containers for dried herbs. Their imperfections were masked by linen cloth and fade in the sun-purifying heat. These salted fish would later be crushed into paste or boiled into stew, eaten with flat bread or spooned into bowls shared by many. It was not gourmet, but it was dependable. It held the taste of river and fire, and of necessity turned into ritual. Some say the poor ate it every day. Others say the rich ate it with honey, just to remind themselves they could. Either way, it was a fruit touched by salt, sealed by sun, and held together by clay and memory. Part 4. A sip of sour beer for people in every class. In the sunburned land of ancient Egypt, beer was not a drink of indulgence. It was survival. By sunrise, while the Nile still shimmered with morning mist, workers, farmers, and priests alike were already sipping their first bowl of sour beer. It was not a cold, it was not fizzy, it was not meant to refresh, it was nourishment, thick, cloudy, and faintly tangy, on the grains left to ferment. In ceramic jars lined with date residue, children drank it too, though in gentler form. The alcohol content was mild, unfiltered by modern standards, and filled with nutrients that bread alone could not offer. In villages, mothers poured it into shallow clay bowls, placing them beside baskets of onions and figs. It was a meal and a medicine, especially when clean water could not be trusted. Each household brewed its own. Some added herbs, others added honey, when they could afford it. Brewing days were busy, the air heavy with the scent of malted grain and moist straw. Women stirred the mixture with carved wooden paddles, humming as they worked. the clay ovens crackling nearby. When it was ready, the beer was ladled into jars, sealed with linen and marked with a simple sign, a gesture saying, "This jar belongs to us." In temples, offerings of beer were left for the gods. In tombs, miniature jars of beer were buried beside the dead, an assurance that even in the afterlife, the soul would never thirst. Sour beer was not just a beverage, it was a thread woven through every moment of the day, from breakfast to blessing, from the harvest field to the sacred altar. It tasted of earth and effort. It connected generations. And in a land where the desert watched every drop of moisture with suspicion, that cloudy sip, modest, ancient, sustaining, was life itself. Part 5. Grinding wheat with quiet hands. In the heart of an Egyptian home, far from the noise of festivals or temples, there is the quiet rhythm of survival. Before bread, before beer, before anything nourishing touched a tongue, there was the grain, and with the grain came the grind. Two women kneel side by side on woven mats. One is older, her hands toughened by decades. The other is younger, still learning the weight of the stone. Between them, a flat granite slab, worn smooth by time, the Wernstone. They passed the pestle back and forth without speaking. One pushes, the other pulls. A slow, scraping lullaby, sung by sand and friction. The air smells of grain dust and sun-warmed stone. Outside, the harvest has been gathered in baskets. Inside, the future is being shaped, handful by handful, into powder. Grinding wheat is not glamorous. It takes hours, sometimes days. But in these grains lies everything. Bread for children, beer for strength, flour for offerings to the gods. The women hum softly, an old melody passed down with the recipe. Their backs ache, their knees press against the mat until they go numb, but still they grind. In ancient Egypt, the grind was to feed, to grind was to break, to grind was to love without words. Part 6. The clay oven at dusk. At the end of a long day in the sun, the scent of baking bread marked the return of warmth, not from the sky, but from the clay oven. Shaped like an upright beehive and stained with soot, it stood in the corner of the courtyard, its mouth glowing orange at dusk crept over the Nile. Women knelt beside it, stacking dry reeds and date fronds as fuel. A child handed flat rounds of dough, each one pressed with careful fingers and scattered with sesame or crushed herbs. The heat inside was alive. The oven whispered with crackles and occasional sighs of smoke, which curled skyward in dark ribbons. There were no timers, no thermometers, only the practiced eyes of women who had watched the crust rise since girlhood. A paddle slid in, pulled out, slid it again. Batches of bread came forth, golden, blistered, soft at the center and crisp at the edge. The smell, warm, tangy, earthy, filled the air long before the stars appeared. The family waited nearby, not by plates, but with open hands. The bread was shared immediately. torn apart while still steaming, dipped in oil, or eaten with dried fish. Conversations were soft, the eyes were tired, but around that oven, in the cool shadow of evening, life still had heat, not just from fire, but from routine, from hunger met, from hands that worked without hurry. Part 7. Eating with Fingers and Silence. In the world of ancient Egypt, meals were not loud affairs. There were no clinking forks, no scraping knives, and rarely the buzz of idle chatter. Eating was a quiet ritual, performed mostly with hands and humility. People sat cross-legged on reed mats or low stools. There was no grand table, just shared clay dishes placed between them on the floor. The bread was torn by hand. Beans, lentils, and dates were pinched between fingers. Olive oil and honey were dabbed with care. Meat, if there was any, was rare and honored, offered in small pieces. Silence was not awkward, it was expected. Speaking during meals was reserved for blessing or thanks. The food itself was sacred, grown by the hands of family, cooked by the fire tended daily, eaten slowly to be honored both the gods and the laborer. Children learn by watching. Elders pass down rhythm and grace, not by instruction, but by quiet example. You chewed slowly, you didn't reach it, you didn't waste it. Eating was survival, it was communion, and in a land where good food depended on the mercy of the Nile, a meal was never taken for granted. To eat was to be still, and in that stillness, even the humblest lentil stew could feel divine. Part 8. Feast for the Dead. In ancient Egypt, food wasn't only sustenance for the living, it was an offering to the dead. When someone passed, the home didn't fall into silence. Instead, preparations began. Bread was baked, beer was brewed, and dates were gathered into clay dishes. Meat, if the family could afford it, was cooked with care. Everything that once brought the deceased comfort was placed near the body or within a tomb, as though death were only a long journey, and the traveler would soon grow hungry. Families set up small altars, even in simple homes. Clay figurines, incense burners, and plates of offerings would line a shelf near the wall. At dusk, candles flickered in quiet memory. Children were taught not to cry too loudly. Let them hear the prayers, not the sorrow. Elders would say, "Feasts for the dead were shared by the living." People sat in a circle, eating slowly, speaking gently. Food bridged the world. Bread for the body, words for the soul. Some left a piece untouched, set aside for the one who could no longer eat, but whose spirit might still sit among them. These rituals were not rare or grand. They were ordinary acts of remembrance, woven into the daily life of ancient Egypt. To eat was to honor, to remember, and to believe deeply that no one ever truly left, as long as someone still shared a meal in their name. Part 9. The Empty Table During Drought. In the blistering sun of a Nile drought, when the river poured away from the banks like a receding breath. Tables across Egypt grew emptier by the day. Clay jugs, once full of water, were now cool and silent. Bread, so often taken for granted, became a memory. Families gathered not to eat, but to sit together around bare tables, as if the ritual of the meal might summon the food itself. Mothers broke stale crumbs into smaller pieces. For children who had long forgotten what it meant to be full, men stared at the horizon, not in prayer, but in calculation, counting days, counting jars, counting goats. The drought came not with fire or wind, but silence, the kind that pressed against your chest and slowed your breath. Crops shriveled where they stood. Fish disappeared from canals. Even the cats, once plump and bold, moved slower, leaner, with careful eyes. In the wealthier households, jars of preserved figs and pickled radishes re-emerged, treated with reverence, but most had nothing left to open. So they waited and waited, not just for water, but for the sound of chewing, for the clatter of bowls, but for the laughter that used to float between bites. Some offered the gods what little they had, a single onion, a cup of beer. They whispered into the dust, hoping the act of sacrifice would bring relief. But often there was no sign, just the sun, the cracked earth, and the sound of the child say, "I'm not hungry," though his stomach said otherwise. Because in drought, hunger becomes polite, silence replaces begging, and the empty table becomes both an altar and a grave. Part 10. Honey for the gods, and sometimes us. In ancient Egypt, honey was more than just sweetness. It was divine, a golden substance said to be born from the tears of the sun god Ra. Sticky and shimmery, it was offered at temples, sealed into tombs, and saved for those who mattered most. The gods, the dead, and sometimes the very sick. Most common folk never tasted it. A pot of honey could be worth a month's wages. Beekeeping, a sacred art, took place in special enclosures. The hives, made of clay cylinders, stacked horizontally. The bees buzzes under the heat of the Nile sun, guided by expert hands and prayers whispered to the heavens. When harvested, honey was strained through woven cloth and poured into earthen jars. The scent was wild, a mixture of flowers, dust, and smoke. It preserved fruit, soothed wounds, and sweetened the rarest of meals. For the few who had access, a spoonful could be medicine, ritual, or luxury, all in one. Even in times of hunger, a small offering of honey was placed before statues. It wasn't to feed the gods, but to remind the people, and perhaps the universe, that sweetness still existed, even when life turned bitter. Part 11. Fig trees, ghosts, and dust. In the heart of the village, beyond the shadow of temple stones and palace walls, life clung to whatever could grow or survive. The fig tree stood there, twisted and defiant, as if it had known hundreds of dry seasons. Its roots dove deep into the cracked earth, fighting moisture where there should have been none. Around it, goats wandered lazily, chewing at the dust, their ribcages visible beneath sun-bleached fur. They were not prized for their beauty, but for what they could give. Milk, sometimes, meat, only rarely. Figs were something else entirely. They were sweet, stubborn gifts from a land that forgot how to be kind. A ripe fig could soften the day. Its sticky, red interior felt like a treasure when the world offered so little else. Children chased after the fruits when they dropped. Elders ate them slowly, savoring the moment. Farmers bartered with them like coins, and when they dried, they lasted, becoming something to chew on while waiting for better days. The dust, of course, was everywhere. It coated the skin. It settled in folds of linen. It lived in cracks of wooden doors and the creases around tired eyes. No one bothered to brush it away. Dust was a fact of life, like the heat, like hunger, like time, and yet, within that dust and heat and quiet ache, something survived. A branch bore fruit, a goat gave milk, a child laughed while climbing the fig tree. The gods may have watched from afar, but on the ground, these were the small victories people held on to. Part 12. Water from the Canal, a cup of muddy life. In the Nile Valley, water meant everything. It was the bread of the land, the god beneath the boats, and the thread that bound villages together. But water didn't come from clean, bubbling springs. It came from the canal, a slow-moving, muddy artery carved by generations of hands and prayers. Each morning, women and children walked barefoot to its edge, carrying clay jars on their hips. They dipped them in without ceremony, watching tiny whirlpools swirl as the jars filled with the heavy, silty drink. The water was thick with the earth itself, brown, warm, and alive with things too small to see. It was not about purity, it was about survival. They would pour it into wide bowls, waiting for the sediment to sink. If lucky, a cloth would be placed over the rim to strain out bits of grasses or wandering insects. The taste, dust and summer heat. The texture, a reminder that life and the Nile shared the same color. Boiling was rare. Firewood was precious, so a squeeze of sour tamarind or a pinch of desert salt helped distract the tongue. People grew up with this water in their blood. It ran through the old man who whispered to goats, the mother who baked flat bread at dawn, and the child who scooped up the final drops with cracked palms. This was water, and this was not clean. It was home. Part 13. The midday nap before the meal. In the blistering midday heat of ancient Egypt, when the sun reigned over every stone and reed, even hunger took a moment to rest. Before the first bite of bread or sip of beer, there was silence and sleep. A man lies on a woven mat under a shaded courtyard, his arms crossed over his chest, linen robes clinging loosely to his resting form. Nearby, a child curls up in the arms of a sibling, the soft hush of their breath, a rhythm older than the pyramids. The scent of rising dough lingers in the air, but no one stirs, not yet. The practice was simple and universal. Before meals, when the stomach began to ache, one slept. Food preparation took time. Grinding, kneading, waiting, while the clay oven absorbed the day's heat, while fish dried in the sun. People surrendered to stillness. It was not laziness, but necessity. To do nothing was sometimes to survive. This nap, this pause, was a kind of offering, a gift to the body before it received another. In the silence, dreams drifted in, of feast, of cool water, or breezes, through papyrus groves. Sometimes they woke still hungry. Other times the hunger passed. In a world ruled by sun and scarcity, the midday nap was not indulgence. It was ritual, habit, and resilience, a reminder that even in hunger there could be peace. Part 14. The flute made of reed. In the quiet breath between the heat of noon and the shadows of dusk, a soft note drifts across the village. It's not the cry of a bird. It's not the rustle of palm leaves. It's a flute, not carved from ivory or silver, but a humble piece of reed, dried and hollowed, shaped by hands that know rhythm better than language. A young boy sits beneath a palm awning, bare feet dusty, knees hugged to his chest. He plays not for anyone in particular, just for the breeze, for the gods maybe. The tune wanders like the Nile itself, slow, uncertain, with moments of joy tucked between pauses. Children gather near, drawn like moths to warmth, and listen without speaking. The flute is not just music, it's memory carried in breath. Each note is a grain of sand lifted by time. His father once played this very flute before the boy could walk, and his father before him, when the reeds were younger and the land wetter. It's been passed through mouths and lungs more than hands, passed through silence. Some days the melody is lively, skipping like goat hoops on stone. Other days it's thin and tired, like the crops in a long drought. But it always plays. It's a part of the air now, a sound woven into clay walls and cracked stone steps. When the sun leans low, the flute is put away, not because the music is done, but because it must be missed for it to return. The boy does his feet past the reed gently, like a sleeping bird, and steps inside. The song lingers, thinner now, but still there, like wind over the dunes. Part 15. Dancers in the temple courtyard. In the heart of an ancient Egyptian temple, where the sandstone walls glow orange beneath the rising sun, silence is not stillness, it's movement. The soft patter of bare feet on stone, the flutter of linen skirts, the hiss of breath drawn through parted lips. This is a courtyard not meant for words, but for gestures. Here the dancers arrive before the priests. They bring no offerings of grain or incense. Their devotion is in the turn of a wrist, the bend of a spine. In the early light, their shadows stretch long across the temple floor, like ancestral spirits joining in the rite. To watch them is to witness prayer in motion. One dancer lifts her arms as if beckoning the wind. Another arches her back, neck exposed to the sky, eyes closed, a silent surrender. Around them, painted pillars tell stories of gods and kings, but the dancers tell no tale. Their rhythm is the offering. Their silence is the hymn. The music is spare, a single flute, a small hand drum, and the echo of movement. There are no audiences here, only statues of deities who do not blink, the goddesses of fertility, of music, of joy. They are all watching, perhaps listening, perhaps remembering the first dancers who moved here when the temple was new and the paint still bright. No one claps when the dance ends. No one shouts praise. The dancers bow not to people, but to stone. Then they vanish behind the colonnades, leaving only dust swirling in their place. And in that dust, still warm, is a kind of presence, like the gods had leaned in closer for just a moment. In this sacred courtyard, then it's not performance, it's a ritual, it's a memory, it's a body's way of speaking when words are too small. Part 16. The Puppet Show for the Afterlife. In the shaded corners of village courtyards or temple outbuildings, small wooden puppets dance their slow ritual steps, held by strings, guided by fingers worn from decades of grain shotting and bread kneading. These humble figures laid out tales not for the living, for those who had left. It wasn't entertainment, as we understand it. There was no applause, no children laughing in rows. These were quiet performances, sometimes with only the puppet master and a bowl of incense as audience. The figures represented gods, animals, ancestors, and the souls of the departed themselves. In a time when death was both ordinary and holy, Egyptians believed that these puppet shows helped soothe restless spirits, guiding them to the other side, reminding them they were not forgotten. Some puppets were simple, just clay heads with stick arms. Others, passed down through generations, wore painted linen robes and bore symbols of sacred protection. Strings were sometimes woven with locks of hair from a lost loved one, adding weight and memory to each movement. During great funerals, larger puppet displays might be performed alongside chants and drums, but more often it was one person, late in the day, retelling a myth of miniature, their voice rising and falling like wind through reeds. In these tiny treasures of art and ritual, the living reached across the veil. Part 17. Juggling days and pebbles. In the dried heat of Egyptian afternoon, a group of children gathered beneath the shade of a broad mud brick wall. Their laughter, soft but unbothered, fluttered like linen in the breeze. There were no carved toys, no shining marbles or dolls with painted eyes. What they had were pebbles, smooth ones, warm from the sun, and dates fallen from a nearby palm. One girl crouched low, balancing 3 stones on the back of her hand. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed them upward and tried to catch one before the others fell. Another child counted how many times she could spin a date fruit in the air without dropping it. The game had no name, no official rules. It simply passed from older sibling to younger, like the scent of bread or the sound of temple chants in the evening. Some games were meant to mimic the others. They built miniature boats from sticks and clay, reenact funeral for dead beetles, or dance like the priests they saw at ceremonies. Others were pure inventions, born from boredom and sun-drenched imagination. They played until their fingers were dusty and their forehead slick with sweat, and still they lingered, daring each other to one more round. No others watched, no one said, "That's foolish." In this moment, in this silver of time, carved between chores and the fading light, they were free. They were heirs to a world that did not yet ask too much of them. Just the courage to laugh, to balance, to throw and catch. They would grow, they would learn to grind, grain and carry water, but for now they were still children who juggled dates and pebbles as if it were sacred, and in a way maybe it was. Part 18. The clay doll in a straw bed. In the hush of an Egyptian night, where only the distant braying of donkeys and the whisper of the river reeds filled the air, a child lay curled on a straw mat, their bodies still sticky with the heat of the day, rose and fell in a soft rhythm. Next to them, nestled in a straw, was a simple doll, no eyes, no smile, no joints, just clay shaped by a mother's hands. The doll had no name, but it was heavy with presence. It didn't laugh or move, but it listened. It had listened through countless evenings of sickness and quiet hunger, through long days of chores and sunstroke. It held the child's silence better than any sibling. In a home where food was shared but words were sacred, where stories were spoken through gestures and glances, the doll became a keeper of small secrets. Its rough edges bore the rub of many fingers, sticky from dates, dusty from walking barefoot. The child never asked for other toy, not because they loved this one too deeply, but because they didn't expect anything else. There was no parade of colors, no sharp shelves lined with wooden trinkets. There was only this, a shape made from the earth beneath their feet, dried under the same sun that darkened their skin. When night came, the dawn lay beside them, unmoving, unjudging, unbreakable. In dreams, perhaps it came to life, but in the waking world, it stayed at its word, quiet, waiting, and always there. Part 19. Laughter during a sandstorm. The sandstorm came with warning, as they often did. One moment, the village was quiet beneath the midday heat, and the next, the horizon blurred, swallowed by yellow haze. Sand scraped against walls, bit into skin, and found its way into every crevice. Mothers pulled linen across the windows. Children were caught inside, and clay pots outside were toppled by the gusts. And yet, somewhere in the half-dark of the storm, laughter rang out. A boy had dared to leap from one doorway to another, pretending the sand was the Nile in flood. His sister, face wrapped in a headcloth, followed, shrieking half in joy, half in fear. Their grandmother scolded them, waving a wooden spoon, but couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her wrinkled lips. Inside, the world was muffled. The walls shuddered under the force of wind, and bowls of lentils and bread were quickly covered. Still, the storm was not a curse, not always. For a moment, it brought everyone close. Fathers stopped work, children gathered at their mothers' feet, and neighbors, unable to leave, stayed for tea and shared silence. The sand painted everything in gold. It stole color and detail from the world outside, turning it soft like a memory. In the midst of it, someone began to hum an old song, one about a fisherman and the river goddess, and others joined in, not because they loved the tune, but because it filled the air with something other than wind. By the time the storm passed, laughter still lingered in the dust-filled corner of the home. No one knew why they laughed during storms, maybe to forget the dryness of their throats, maybe to resist the wetness of the desert itself. But they did, and in doing so, they reminded each other that fear, like sand, could be swept away. Part 20. Storytelling by Firelight. When the Nile's hush deepened into night, and the wind of the desert cooled the backs of sleeping goats, that was when stories began. Not the kind written on papyrus or carved into stone. These tales lived in the gaps between shadows and firelight, passed from mouth to ear, from winkle to child's wide eyes. An old man would sit cross-legged on a reed mat, his voice rough like sun-baked earth, and he would begin not with once upon a time, but with a breath. Sometimes that was enough. The children would settle close, knees tucked, hands still. The fire cracked and popped as if it, too, wanted to interrupt, but not one did. These weren't tales of kings or gods, at least not always. They were stories of talking crocodiles and donkeys that outsmarted merchants, of girls who tricked the wind, of a jar that never emptied until someone spoke aloud its name. They twisted and looped, sometimes ending before they ended, sometimes never ending at all. In these moments, time softened. The sandstorm earlier in the day was forgotten. The hunger lashed sharp. The hard stone floor, warm now with sweat-bodied and breath. And when the fire shrank into a quiet red heart, and the last tale dissolved into the night air, no one clapped, no one thanked the teller. The story would tell itself again, someday. That was enough. Part 21. Games of balance on a boat. In the golden light of late afternoon, when the heat of the day had finally eased, children in ancient Egypt would gather by the edge of the Nile, not to fish or to walk, but to play. Boats, small and shallow, made of papyrus reeds or carved wood, rocked gently on the current near the village. They weren't meant for long journeys today. Instead, they became floating playgrounds. The challenge? To climb upward and stay upright, barefoot and agile. Boys and girls would try to stand tall, arms outstretched like ibis wings, adjusting their weight to the river's quiet rhythms. One misstep and splash, the water welcomed them without warning. Their laughter echoed off the banks. Sometimes they held jars or bowls while balancing, pretending to be both men or dancers. Others turned it into a race. Who could stay on longest? Who could make it from one end to other without falling? The Nile, patient and playful, cradled their joy. Parents watched from the shore, half worried, half smiling. The river could be gentle, but it remembered everything. And still the games went on. No carved toys or polished stones. No counting points or winners, just balance of body, breadth, and boldness. Above the deep, slow-moving waters. Some fell in and climbed down again. Some stood still sunset, and all of them, soaked or dry, remembered that what it felt like to trust their feet, the river, and the moment. Part 22. Storytelling by Firelight. In ancient Egypt, when the sun had slipped behind the horizon, and the wind grew soft over the Nile, the house fell into a familiar hush. The fire crackled softly, casting amber light on mud brick walls and weathered faces. They gathered not for news, not ritual, but for story. The storyteller, usually the eldest in the family, sat cross-legged by the fire pit. His voice was dry like a desert, steady like the current. He did not rush. His stories weren't made of endings. They were made for the space between breaths, for the flicker of firelight on closed eyes. The tales weren't always grand. They might be about a bird who refused to leave the same tree, a woman who whispered to crocodiles, or a fisherman who put up more questions than fish. But the children leaned in just the same, heads resting on their knees, ears wide like temple doors. Some stories were passed down from the time of pharaohs, whose name no one dared to speak. Some were made up yesterday, none were written. That wasn't the point. The point was the quiet laughter, the long pauses, the comfort of knowing that the story would continue tomorrow, slightly changed, slightly familiar, like the stars above or the silt below. And when someone finally asked, "Then what happened?" the storyteller would smile, stare into the flame and say, "I don't know. The part hasn't happened yet." Part 23. Games of balance on a boat. Long before spinning tops and digital screens, the children of ancient Egypt found joy in simpler, wobblier things, like balance games. Aboard boats that rocked gently over the Nile. Picture a wooden canal-shaped vessel, carved roughly but lovingly tied near the riverbank. As the sun mellowed toward afternoon, children climbed in one by one, barefoot and determined. The rules: don't fall, don't splash, stay upright. One boy sweated at the bow, arms out like wings, while two girls tiptoed behind him, giggling, wobbling, catching each other's elbows. A fourth child, older, sat cross-legged near the rear, pretending to be captain, issuing playful commands with a dried papyrus reed. The game wasn't just fun, it was survival training disguised as laughter. On the Nile, balance was life. Boats tipped, fish slipped, water rose. These games taught patience, taught muscle memory. A misstep here was only a splash and a soaked tunic, but out in the deeper waters, it might mean much more. Nearby, an elder watched, eyes crinkled, chewing a reed, memories surfacing. He too once stood in that boat, steadying his footing while his brother made faces from the bank. No score was kept, no prize was given, but everything shout, everything staggered, every moment upright was a small triumph over the river's will. Part 24. Paintings that never moved. In the cool shade of temple walls and family tombs, where sunlight barely reached, the people of ancient Egypt told stories, not with moving images, but with color and stone. Their murals were vibrant, precise, and eternal. Each brushstroke captured the rhythm of life and the rituals of death. There were no frames per second, no reels or screens, just pigments made of crushed minerals, pressed into plaster, sealing in a memory forever. Children learned these images long before they could read. A god with jackal's head, a boat gliding across celestial waters, a line of dancers frozen mid-step. These weren't just decorations, they were instructions. How to honor, how to die, how to live. In the silence of a tomb, a feast was always taking place. Loaves of bread never grew stale on the painted offering tables. Musicians played stringed instruments no one would ever hear. The dead sat upright in their idealized forms, enjoying the eternal version of their favorite meals. These scents comforted the living. They reassured them that something, anything, would last. Even in humble homes, small wall carvings or painted tiles preserved moments of laughter or harvest. Art was not luxury, it was ritual, memory, and fate. The brush did not just capture the past, it tried to shape the future. No one paintings were identical, but they all shared the same silence, a stillness more beautiful and powerful than motion. And for the ancient Egyptians, that was enough. Part 25. Evenings without drama. In the fading light of the Egyptian day, when the last of the golden sun bled into the horizon and the Nile mirrored the sky's slow exhale, the village settled into something softer. There were no plays to attend, no taverns humming with laughter. There were no lanterns swinging above cobbled streets, nor music spilling from open windows. Evening arrived quietly, as it always had. The courtyard was where most of life happened, and it was there they returned when the work was done. Woven mats unrolled on packed earth. A small clay oil lamp flickered, casting shadows that wavered like spirits against mud brick walls. Someone might hum a half-forgotten tune, not for show, but for rhythm. Others simply sat, fingers busy with thread or date stamps, eyes following the night birds as they circled over the palms. Ears listened for the gentle splash of fish in irrigation canals. Time passed in fragments, not measured in stories, but in silences between them. No one asked, "What shall we do tonight?" They already knew. Nothing. Or perhaps everything, if one measured life not in spectacles, but in the stillness between chores and sleep. Here, the drama was in the way a breeze carried the scent of warm grain, or how the neighbor's baby finally stopped crying. The world of the gods, so grand, so full of ritual, had little to do with this hour. Evening belonged to the living, and what the living needed most often was not noise or excitement, but a pause. In that pause, they breathed, they remembered, they waited for the stars. Part 26. Smelling the Perfume Oil. In the sweltering heat of ancient Egypt, where silence fell thick between mud brick walls and the Nile shimmered in the distance, pleasure did not always come in grand festivals or lavish banquets. Sometimes it came in a small clay jar, sealed with linen and beeswax, hidden from the sun. The jar contained oil, not for food, not for flame, but for the soul, blended with crushed lotus petals, cinnamon bark, myrrh resin, or the rare essence of blue lily. Blue lily, it was a gift from the senses. When life felt too heavy or the desert too still, Egyptians reached for scent. It wasn't sprayed or splashed like perfume today. Instead, they uncorked it gently, inhaling deeply, one slow breath, then another. The aroma was said to calm the spirit, open the mind, and sometimes awaken desire. For priests, this was meditation. For the weary farmer, it was an escape. For women, it was elegant, and for the dying, it was comfort. There was no music playing, no one talking, just the presence of oil, and the hearse is invited. Even the children would pause, if only briefly, when their grandmother opened her scented pot. It was believed these oils carried divine energy. Some families offered them to gods, others saved them for moments of sorrow or longing. The wealthy wore them behind the ears or on their wrists. The poor dabbed them onto mats and lay still, eyes closed, letting the scent carry them somewhere else. No incense, no flame, no chanting, just breath and time. And that was enough. Part 27. The mat where they sat and waited. It was only a woven reed mat, faded by time and use, laid flat against the earth floor of a modest Egyptian home. But to those who sat on it, it was more than a place to rest. It was a rest hold, not between rooms, but between emotions. There were no clocks in ancient Egypt, no buzzing reminders or chimes. Time passed by the shifting light, the angle of shadows, the sound of birds outside the window. So people waited, often in silence, on that mat. A mother sat there waiting for her son to return from the field. An elder waited for pain to pass. A younger waited for night to fall so she could tell a story. Sometimes they waited without purpose, because waiting had become a rhythm, because the mat was always there, and because sitting together, saying nothing, was sometimes the only thing to do. The mat absorbed everything: hopes, disappointments, quiet laughter. It smelled of sand or crushed crash, or long-forgotten conversations. It held creases where knees had breast and frayed edges where fingers had picked at the weave during long hours. Even guests knew to sit on the mat and wait, without asking why. It was understood. Not at all waiting had an answer. Some waited for change, others for peace, and a few simply waited for the day to end. And when they stood up and left, the mat remained, still and patient, for the next soul who needed to sit, to breathe, and to wait. Part 28. The Blue Lotus in the Cup. By day, the blue lotus floated gently atop temple palms, its petals reaching toward rose golden light, but by night its essence was drawn into water or wine, placed carefully in a small clay cup, and passed quietly from one hand to another. To Egyptians, these flowers wasn't merely decoration, it was transformation. Crushed and soaked, the Blue Lotus released a mild, dream-like euphoria. It softened the edges of sorrow, slowed down conversations, and lifted the body without moving a limb. For those who drank it, the night became a little quieter, the stars a bit closer. In homes with no more bread but a single blossom left, the lotus became comfortable. Widows, healers, scribes, all knew of its power. No loud, no overwhelming, just enough to ease the pain of the present moment. It did not erase grief, it simply allowed one to sit with it, without flinching. Some said it opened the gate to dreams, and that one could meet ancestors more clearly under its haze. Others used it before music, or prayer, or solitude. The Blue Lotus asked for nothing in return, only stillness. And in the morning, the cup would be empty, but the silence it left behind, soft, thick, forgiving, would linger long after the sun rose again. Part 29. Incense for the gods and for sleep. As twilight thickened over the Nile, a small clay bowl was set alight in the corner of the room. Resin cracked quietly over embers, sending spirals of fragrant smoke upward. Frankincense, myrrh, and ground acacia, sacred gifts, but also tools of comfort. To the gods, incense was an offering. To the living, it was memory, protection, and the gentle pull of slumber. In temples, priests waved censers to awaken statues and honor ancient names. But in modest homes, a pinch of resin was burned to soothe a child's cough, mark the end of a hard day, or ask for peaceful dreams. The smoke didn't just carry scent, it carried thoughts. Whispers said through lips too tired to speak aloud. Regrets, hopes, names all rose with the smoke and curled into corners of the house like silent prayers. Children would fall asleep watching it, their eyes tracing the slow dance of vapor. Adults would close their eyes and breathe in, letting the sharpness of the day fall away. In a world where medicine was rare and words were few, incense was a language of its own, and when the flame finally died and the room cooled, what lingered wasn't just the scent. It was the hush, the stillness, the feeling that for a moment everything was being heard. Part 30. The wine before the vision. The cup was made of clay, plain and unpainted, yet the wine it held was thick as blood, unowned as memory. In the hush of the temple's side chamber, the seer did not speak, she only drank. It was no wine for laughter or celebration. It was sacred, fermented from dates, figs, and secrets, infused with herbs passed down from priests to British. This drink blurred the edges of the real and invited the gods to whisper through smoke and shadow. The initiate knelt nearby, silent, waiting. He had questions about the harvest, about a child's fate, about a dream he had 3 nights in a row. But silence was part of the ritual. The vision would come, or it would not. The seer closed her eyes. The wine warmed her chest, and with it came the drift of images, of old voices, of something not quite sleeping. In the dark behind her lids, she saw a blue jackal, a cracked well, a river fish leaping without water, and then nothing. When she opened her eyes again, she said only one thing: "The gods are listening." That was enough. Part 31. Oils that work the skin. The room was quiet, save for the soft splash of oil into a shallow dish. A woman sat cross-legged beside her mother's leg, her fingers glistening with amber liquid, thick with crushed flowers and resin, the scent of marjoram and blue lotus curled in the air, not overpowering but insistent, like a memory pressing itself forward. It was not healing in the sense of daughters of gods. It was a treasure passed from daughter to mother, from aunt to niece, in evenings when words had already been used up and only touch remained. The oil was warmed by the sun earlier that day. Now it traced its way along tired calves, corn-loused heels, and the ridge up a spine that had bent over fields and ovens. For some, the ritual meant readiness to wake, to walk again. For others, it was a way to rest. The skin drank it slowly, hungrily, as if it remembered every day it went without this softness. Outside, sand scraped against the walls, but inside, the only movement was the slow circle of the hand and the slow exhale that followed it. The body was no longer just a tool, it was something to be honored. Part 32. The priest's herbal mix. No one knew the exact recipe. That was the point. Each priest who served in the House of Life carried a pouch, small, woven from date palm fiber, stained at the edges from years of use. Inside, powdered bark, dried leaves, bits of resin, maybe a scorpion's tail, or a silver of obsidian. What mattered was the mix, and the hands that mixed it, in the temple's quietest chamber, away from worshippers and even from the junior scribes. This blend would be crushed and stirred with wine, or sometimes oil. It was not meant to cure exactly, though some said it could soothe fevers or calm a frantic mind. It was a tool for visions, for dreams, for silence so deep that one could hear the gods breathing. The priest would close his eyes, inhale, and chant, not to be heard, but to anchor himself. Those nearby claimed the room's air would shift, heavy but not suffocating, as if something ancient had entered and decided to stay a while. The mix was applied to statues, poured into offering bowls, or burned in rituals that even other priests were not invited to witness. And when the priest died, the last of his mix was buried with him. No heirs, no apprentices, just the scent, faint and lingering, on the wrappings of the dead. Part 33. The Dream Chamber. It was not a bedroom, though it had a bed, and it was not a temple, though the air hung thick with incense and quiet reverence. The dream chamber lay hidden behind the stone corridors of the priest's quarters, far from sunlight, carved with symbols meant not to be seen but to be felt. There one did not lie down to rest, but to search. The bed itself was made of polished wood, sloped gently at the head, with a headdress shaped like a crescent. Mats of woven reed softened the floor, and the walls glimmered faintly with mineral-based paint, not to decorate but to guide. Each line was a path, each curve a whisper of gods who waited on the edge of consciousness. The person chosen to enter, sometimes a priest, sometimes a seeker, would drink a small cup of wine laced with the sacred mix, Blue Lotus, poppy, mandrake. Then they would lie still, breathing slowed, time shifted, and in that silence they hoped for a vision, a word, a face, a sign. Not all returned with answers, but all returned changed. Some said the chamber was alive, that it listened, that if you weren't ready, it would remain silent, holding its rings tight within stone walls. But for those deemed worthy, a message might come in the voice of a long dead king, or in a dream where the Nile ran backwards. The dream chamber never locked, but only a few ever entered twice. Part 34. Figs so ripe they fermented themselves. At the edge of the village, where the soil was dry but the sun was kind, there stood an old fig tree. No one remembered who planted it. It simply had always been there, twisting, leaning, offering shade and something more. Its fruit, small and purple-brown, never shouted for attention, but when they ripened, they did so with a richness no market fig could match. And when they were left on the branch too long, whether by forgetfulness or design, they did not rot, they transformed. The figs softened under the desert sun, their skins thinning like whispers. Inside, they began to bubble. The warmth of the day and the sugars within worked together, unseen, turning flesh into wine without a vessel. If plucked at the right moment, the fig would drip, not with juice but with something stronger. Elders spoke of those who would taste the future in such figs. Children, of course, were warned not to eat them, but they did, in secret, laughing at the sour sting and the strange giddiness that followed. A quiet rebellion beneath the tree's branches. Some claimed the gods smiled on that tree, that it knew when the village needed joy more than sweetness. In hard years, the figs fermented faster, as if to offer a kind of soft, sun-born mercy. Even now, when the tree fruits, villagers tread softly. They take what they need. They leave a few to the sun. And if, one afternoon, someone walks a little lighter, smiles a little longer, no one asks too many questions. Part 35. Sniffing the myrrh for courage. Bravery came not in roars, but in scent. Before a battle, before confession, before crossing the river that separated the known from the unknown. Myrrh, it wasn't worn like perfume, it wasn't burned like incense. It was held close, cradled in small clay pots, or wrapped in linen, and brought to the nose in a quieter breath. In the temples, priests used it to steady their hands before rituals. Warriors dabbed a touch beneath their collars, inhaling deeply before donning armor. Mothers pressed it into their children's palms before farewells. For many, it wasn't a luxury, it was preparation. The scent was sharp, earthy, and ancient. It awakened something old within the chest. Not pride, not anger, but steadiness. A kind of clarity that came from standing still while the world moved fast. No one quite agreed on where its power came from. Some said it was a gift from a goddess. Others believed it held memories of the desert itself, dry wind and burning stone, but most never questions. When fear crept in, they sniffed the myrrh, and when they did not smile, nor did they boast. They simply continued to speak, to walk, to face what waited. Part 36. The girl who could smell rain coming. Some listened to the sky. She listened to the earth. Before the first drop kissed the dry ground, before the clouds had even thickened, she knew. She would stop mid-sentence, lift her head, and inhale. Not dramatically, just enough for her eyes to soften. Rain, she would whisper. Long before any adult felt the breeze change. In her small village on the desert's edge, rain wasn't just water, it was a blessing, a rumor, a prayer, and for the girl with bare feet and a cracked clay bracelet, it was a scent she could sense like no one else. It smelled like stone warming, like dust crawling under invisible fingers, like a promise. They didn't call her a prophet, but they waited. When she tilted her head or squinted at the wind, farmers would pause, potters would cover their drying bowls, old men would mumble and glance at the sky, suddenly skeptical of their bones. No one taught her. Her nose was her compass, her guide. Even the animals followed her stillness. Birds hushed when she paused. Dogs wagged their tails without barking. It rarely rained, but whenever it did, she was right. And when the rain came, slow, hesitant, and holy, she smiled, not with pride, but with relief, as if the world had proven her right again, as if the earth had finally spoken back. Part 37. Whispers in the smoke tent. Not all prayers were loud. Some curled in smoke and never left the ground. In the dim, thickened air of the smoke tent, voices rarely rose above a murmur. The inside was small, woven from reeds, with a roof so low even the breeze had to bend. Some coiled slowly, lazily, from bowls of burning herbs, their scents missing: myrrh, cinnamon, resin, crushed petals. People didn't speak to each other here. They spoke to what was not seen. One by one, villagers entered, a mother with a sick child, a farmer with a broken heart, a woman who had dreamed of scorpions 3 nights in a row. Each sat on the cool ground, pressed their hands to their knees, and whispered. The priest didn't answer. He listened, eyes half closed, hands over the incense. His role was not to speak, but to hold the space, to keep the veil between worlds steady. Sometimes the smoke thinned for a moment. That was when people believed the gods were listening. And sometimes there was a whisper that did not come from any mouth in the room, a voice not carried by breath but by ash. No one laughed with certainty, but many laughed with calm. The tent did not offer truth, only permission to speak to the silence. Part 38. The Ritual of Stillness. Sometimes the loudest worship was done in complete stillness. There was a time in the day, often just after sunset, when a strange quiet settled over certain corners of the village. No drums, no singing, no chants, only people, sitting, breathing, not moving. It wasn't sleep, it wasn't quiet prayer. It was something older, a ritual the elders called becoming stone. They believed that in an absolute stillness, a person could leave their body for a moment and be heard far more clearly by the gods. Children were told to hush, goats were herded away. Even firewood was stacked earlier to avoid noise. The air held its breath. Even the Nile seemed to pause its flow. Participants sat in a circle, palms flat on the ground, eyes open. If a thought came, they let it drift. If fear stirred, they did not flinch. In the silence, they were not asking, they were simply allowed. Sometimes a wind would stir the edge of a rope, or an insect would land unnoticed. These, too, were part of the message. Stillness wasn't just the absence of motion. It was attention. It was an invitation. And when the stars blinked into place, the ritual ended not with a word, but with a single, slow exhale. The gods had been honored in the quiet. Part 39. Breathing with the statue. They said the gods were silent, but stone, if you listened closely, had breathed. In a dim chamber behind the temple, away from offerings, chants, and golden altars, there sat a statue, no taller than a child. It wasn't lavish, no jewels, no inscriptions, just smooth black basalt, shaped into the form of seated deity, with closed eyes and calm smile. This was where the priest came, not to speak, but to listen. At certain hours, often before sunrise or just as the moon reached to its peak, one would kneel beside the statue and breathe, slow, steady, matching their rhythm to what they imagined was the rhythm of stone. Inhale, exhale, no prayers, no incense, no performance, only presence. They believed the statue had been centuries, had endured sandstorms, wars, and the shifting Nile. Its silence, therefore, was not absence, but death. And also, they sat beside it, sometimes for hours, feeling the coolness of the stone, matching breath with the eternal, hoping that in synchronizing their lungs with the lifeless chest of the divine, they might touch something deathless inside themselves. Sometimes they left with no revelation, sometimes with tears, but always with the quiet certainty the gods did not need to speak, because they had already spoken long ago, and it was up to the living to learn how to hear again. Part 40. When the perfume ran out. It was only when the scent faded that people noticed the silence. For months, a little jar had lasted, a blend of lotus, myrrh, and crushed petals sealed in oil. Each morning, the woman dabbed a single drop behind her ears and at the base of her throat. It was a private ritual, not meant to impress, but to remember. The scent reminded her, the river at dusk, of laughter in stone courtyards, of the boy who once brought her the first blue blossom of the season. In a home made of mud brick and woven mats, perfume was a luxury beyond reach, yet it had become essential, not because of vanity, but because in times of drought and loss, even a momentary breath of something beautiful felt like defiance. The one morning, the jar was empty, no scent, no shimmer of memory, just air and silence. She tried to recreate it, mixing oil with wilted petals, warming it near the fire. But it wasn't the same. The balance was gone, like a voice you remember but can't quite imitate. The next days passed slower, her movements more deliberate. She missed nothing in particular, and yet missed everything. In this quiet ache, she began to understand that the perfume had not only been fragrance, it had been hope. Still, life continued. The water was browned, the bread was baked, and the sky turned gold each evening as always. But now, without scent, she moved through the world fully awake, grieving not only for what had ended, but for how sweet it had once been.